Hello and welcome. Thank you for tuning in today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Natalie Ambrosio-Prudhomme, and I'm Director of Communications at 427. As I sit here in Berkeley, seeing increasing smoke outside my window and hearing about evacuation orders all across California, I'm keenly aware of how almost painfully relevant today's topic is. And I'm so glad we're able to take this opportunity to talk about the data and explore how conditions are changing, so that we can take urgent steps towards understanding and preparing for this disastrous hazard. Just a bit of housekeeping before we really dive in. You all attendees will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar, but please feel free to enter your questions at any time during the Q&A box on the screen, and we will have ample time for questions at the end of the session. In a moment, I'll provide introductions to today's panelists, and then we'll dive in. I'll begin by setting the scene briefly with why it's essential to understand changing conditions as wildfires worsen under climate change. Then we'll explain 427's approach to assessing global wildfire potential and share key takeaways for financial stakeholders and other leaders striving to build resilience. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, 427 is an affiliate of Moody's, and we're a provider of data and analytics on the physical risks of climate change. We specialize in distilling huge volumes of climate data into actionable information that leaders can use for decision making. As I mentioned, my name is Natalie. I'm Director of Communications here, and I'm joined today by Colin Gannon, a Director of Research at 427, and Lindsay Ross, a Director of Global Client Services. The impacts of wildfires are widespread and multifaceted, and they're being exacerbated by climate change. 10 of the largest wildfires in Arizona's history occurred in the last 8 years, and 9 of California's largest wildfires occurred in just the last 7. But it's just not here in the Western US. It's really all over the world where this is being experienced. And these fires are deadly, they're costly, and as I mentioned, they're widespread, from Australia to Siberia, Portugal to Brazil, California, Arizona, and many places in between. And what's important to understand is that wildfires do have direct, devastating impacts on business facilities and homes and other buildings, but they also have many multifaceted indirect impacts. So business disruptions are significant, both from loss of materials and facilities and assets, but also from operations disruptions, as seen in Sydney during Australia's 2019-2020 fires. These losses were due to disruptions from employees who couldn't get to work or those that felt sick because of wildfire smoke. And smoke itself has far-reaching impacts that affect areas miles away from where the flames themselves take place. In Mexico City in 2019, nearby wildfires stalled public work projects and led to the halting of several manufacturing operations. In the San Francisco Bay Area during the 2018 Camp Fire, schools were closed across the Bay Area, and outdoor workers had to stop working due to a wildfire that was around 200 miles away. And the severe public health impacts of wildfire smoke are particularly worrisome during today's COVID-19 pandemic. Wildfire smoke has multifaceted health risks that are long-lasting. It's responsible for increasing emergency room visits months after the flames themselves have subsided. Wildfires also lead to complex challenges around insurance. They pose a severe business risk for insurance companies themselves with policies in exposed areas, but they also lead to really challenging questions around if and how to rebuild and who might foot the bill, as insurance companies increasingly pull out of exposed areas, and some governments explore and weigh the costs of giving a public option alongside the moral hazard this may present by encouraging further development in these increasingly exposed areas. And lastly, when wildfires destroy large portions of communities, there are severe implications on the tax base, economic resources, and also real estate markets. Many interacting factors will determine whether and how and when a community is able to rebuild, including insurance coverage, percent of building stock burned, population, and economic vitality. Paradise, California went from a town of 26,000 residents to a town of 2,000 after the Camp Fire, and few of these residents have returned today. All this to say, wildfires are devastating and powerful phenomenon that are becoming increasingly important to understand. I'll now turn it over to Colin to discuss 427's methodology for assessing global wildfire potential.
All right, thank you, Natalie, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Natalie mentioned, I'm going to be taking a look at our methodology to provide some context into how exactly we measure wildfires and their potential risk. Next slide, please. So, global wildfire potential. As Natalie mentioned, wildfires are becoming increasingly more prevalent worldwide and more damaging. And the relationship between wildfires and climate change is highly correlated, but not necessarily one-to-one. Many variables must align for wildfires to take place and spread. Not all of these variables are easily modeled, such as ignition related to human activity, and therefore presents challenges when looking forward in the future to potential wildfire risk. As a result, we do not attempt to predict wildfires, where or when they will occur, but rather look at the conditions conducive to wildfire activity. We refer to this as wildfire potential and is the basis for our scoring. Next slide. So when we talk about wildfire potential, this is an evaluation of conditions that could give rise to a fire, regardless of the acute localized factors such as wind, humidity, ignition source. So we're looking more broadly at the conditions that could give rise to a wildfire, rather than anything probabilistic about the likelihood of wildfires occurring in any given place. So we have two main factors that work into our wildfire potential evaluation. The first is availability of burnable vegetative fuel. So this is looking at fuel sources that could provide the wildfire potential to be elevated. We're also looking at the meteorological conditions related to wildfires. So this is the main drivers for wildfire activity in many places of the world. Next slide. So looking a little more at availability of burnable fuel, we determine this through land cover classification. So basically, we look at land cover in every part of the world and assign a weighting factor based on the potential burnability of that land cover classification type. So in many places, which are desert, bare area, this would be assigned a burnability factor of 0, and dense coniferous forests or deciduous forests, which have a high biomass, would be assigned a factor of 1. So basically, we have a scale 0 to 1, where we're able to assign a weighting factor related to the burnability of different fuel sources. These weights were assigned using literature review, sensitivity testing, and assessment of historical burned areas. So in this visual here, you can see how this plays out globally, where places such as the Sahara receive a score close to 0, if not 0, where there's very little vegetative fuel sources, which could give rise to wildfire. Meanwhile, places such as the Amazon and northern latitudes, where there are dense forests, biomass and the availability of fuels is much higher. So there is a higher potential for wildfires to occur in these regions. Next slide. So looking at the meteorological conditions that could give rise to wildfire, our main method for evaluating this is through the Keach-Byram Drought Index, or the KBDI. This is an index that was created by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Forest Service in 1968 and has been in wide use not only by this agency but around the world for assessing wildfire potential. This is a useful metric for us because it uses data from global climate models, including temperature and precipitation, to describe soil moisture deficit. And this is a key proxy for looking at the conditions that could give rise to wildfires. So when we're referring to KBDI, which ranges from 0 to 100, this is referring to the total amount of water necessary to bring soil moisture back to full capacity. So in essence, soil moisture deficit. So if we have a KBDI of 800, this means we need 800 hundredths of an inch of water to bring soil moisture back to full capacity. So 0, on the other hand, would represent fully saturated soil and very low proxy for wildfire conditions. On the bottom here, Leo et al. 2010 is a paper that we have referred to extensively in our methodology. They presented a 0 to 800 binning system to assign risk to each of these KBDI values. So 0 to 100 represents low risk, while 600, 800 represents extreme risk. So as I'll mention in a moment, we look at places where KBDI exceeds 400 oftentimes to represent high risk potential. And this relates to places where the soil moisture deficit is extreme and is representative of hot and dry conditions, which could give rise to wildfires. Next slide. So this is an example of how KBDI plays out over the course of a year. So this is in Santa Rosa, California, which, as Natalie mentioned, is located here in Northern California and is currently experiencing wildfire activity. In the top graph here, we have temperature over the course of the year. And you can see in summer months in the middle of the year, temperature reaches its apex throughout the year. This is correlated with low precipitation, which tends to die down in California this time of year, and is highest during the winter months. So KBDI, which considers both temperature and precipitation, is represented on the bottom graph here. And you can see how KBDI increases while temperature increases and precipitation declines. So essentially, KBDI peaks after an extended period of high temperature and low precipitation. This red bar represents where KBDI is above 400 and fits into that high classification signed by Leo et al. So essentially, in this graph, we can see that KBDI is in the high risk classification for about a month of the year for Santa Rosa on a typical year. However, once precipitation arrives at the end of the year, we see that KBDI drops quickly, representing that end of season rainfall. So this just gives a sense of how KBDI plays out over the course of the year and gives a little insight into how exactly this function works. Next slide. This is how we evaluate KBDI over the dimensions of varying frequency and raw differential. The top left, we have maximum wildfire potential. And this is basically the highest KBDI value that's achieved throughout a year. So thinking back to that previous graph, that's the peak KBDI value throughout the year. On the axis of differential, we're looking at the change in max KBDI relative to historical baseline. So as we project forward into the future, we see how that KBDI is evolving over time relative to the historical baseline, which we use as 1975 to 2005. On the bottom here, frequency, we're looking at the number of days where KBDI exceeds that 400 threshold and is considered high risk. So as we project out into the future, this is the number of days per year where KBDI is above that red bar, thinking back to that last graph. In the bottom right, we're doing that same sort of comparison of number of future wildfire days relative to the historical baseline in terms of how frequent a place is receiving high wildfire potential conditions. Next slide. So just to bring that all together, this is essentially our end wildfire product, or as we refer to it, our wildfire category score, which is a 0 to 100 score of potential wildfire risk in the future. So this is taking both the availability of burnable fuel sources, that weighting factor of 0 to 1, and combining it with the 4 metrics of KBDI, both raw and differential in the future. So through our methodology, we combine these 4 metrics along with the availability of burnable fuel sources, and get this ultimate wildfire category score, which essentially represents the both total future risk and the changing rate of wildfire potential in the future. So at a very high level, we can see many of the places that pop up are places with the high biomass, so places like the Amazon, Central Africa, and many mountainous foothill regions. But we do also see northern latitudes starting to pop up as well. And this is indicative of places where that differential is higher. So with that, I will turn it over to Lindsay to do a little bit more of a deep dive into some of these scores.
Thanks very much, Colin. Yeah, so thanks for describing the methodology, and thanks as well to Natalie for setting the scene. There have obviously been some very major wildfire events in the recent past and some ongoing right now with serious impacts to people, financial markets, as well as both the natural and built environments. I'll take it from here to discuss the key findings in the report, touching also on what investors and other financial market participants can do with the data to better understand the unpriced costs of climate change. Beyond incorporating previously unforeseen or unpriced costs, this topic also begs the question of what role investors have to play to better understand and help build resilience to wildfires. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide, as I'll be going into more detail on most of the countries and regions mentioned here. I just want to reiterate some of what Colin just mentioned, that in areas that already have wildfires, our results show that wildfire conditions will worsen and will be prevalent throughout longer portions of the year. Deforestation and wildfires will make regions like the Amazon and Southeast Asia even more susceptible than they are today. And these problems together can contribute to runaway climate feedback cycles and tipping points. Another major finding was that areas typically less wildfire prone will start to experience hotter and drier conditions. The rate of warming in the Arctic is twice as high as the rest of the globe, and a record temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded there this June. As temperatures have been rising, extremely large wildfires have been raging in the Arctic the past couple of years, and these areas are less experienced with wildfires and are more likely to be underprepared to deal with them. Towards the end of my remarks, I'll discuss some resilience and adaptation strategies and how financial markets can play an active role in building wildfire resilience. Next slide. As Natalie already mentioned, the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season in Australia was historic. Our analysis shows that every Australian state receives high wildfire scores in some areas, driven by both more wildfire potential days and higher KBDI values. Our analysis shows that Western Australia is highly exposed, with some areas expected to have up to 3 months of high wildfire potential days. This could have significant macroeconomic impacts, since mining exports from Western Australia comprise 48% of Australia's total national exports. Even if a fire doesn't ignite directly on mining land, fires in adjacent areas can disrupt operations. Smoke can create dangerous working conditions and require the suspension of production. That's precisely what happened during the last bushfire season to mining companies like BHP Billiton and Whitehaven in New South Wales. They experienced a respective 11% and 44% drop in production at mines closest to the fires. According to our analysis, 2 additional months per year of high wildfire potential days will be expected in some areas in New South Wales, and the maximum KBDI can reach higher than 500 out of 800. Again, any KBDI greater than 400 is considered high risk. Next slide, please. Moving on to our results for the Amazon rainforest, which of course suffered highly publicized wildfires in 2019 as well. This region will experience an additional month and a half of high wildfire potential days and an increase in KBDI of nearly 100 on the scale reaching almost 500 out of 800 in some areas. Again, anything above 400 is considered high. You can see all of the deep red in the image, which illustrates that the Amazon has a lot of vegetation, which can fuel very large fires. The Amazon fires in 2019 ignited international outcry, with European leaders threatening to back out of a regional trade agreement and some countries suspending their contributions to conservation funds like the Amazon Fund. Because President Bolsonaro had undermined efforts to monitor deforestation and was slow to create a formalized response to the fires, major brands like H&M and The North Face understood that their customers were likely to be outraged. In response, they halted purchases from Brazilian leather suppliers until those suppliers could prove they were not involved in harmful environmental practices like deforestation. Next slide, please. Countries in Southern Europe also receive high wildfire scores. The maximum KBDI in some areas of Greece reach well above 500 out of 800, and some areas of Portugal, which had an outbreak of wildfires last month and has had devastating fires in the last couple of years that killed hundreds of people, will see an additional 30 days of high wildfire potential compared to the historical baseline. Wildfires in Europe are growing increasingly large and more expensive. Since 2000, fires have already caused approximately 3 billion euros in losses per year. The 2019 heat wave broke temperatures in places like France, which saw temperatures as high as 113 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat wave created hot and dry conditions that contributed to the spread of wildfires that were 15% larger than average for this decade. A 10,000-acre fire in Catalonia, Spain, was raging while emergency services were already dealing with hospitalizations from the heat wave. This demonstrates that even areas experienced with wildfires can be caught unprepared. They may have measures in place, but as wildfire seasons become more prolonged, fires become more severe, and hazards like heat waves and wildfires overlap, the current level of resources and wildfire preparedness and firefighting may not be sufficient for the coming future change. Next slide, please. In this global pandemic, it's not difficult to imagine how simultaneous and overlapping risks can disrupt economies and create complications for public health. Blazes in Northern California right now not only make people more susceptible to respiratory illnesses like those caused by COVID-19, but also strain hospital and other emergency response resources, which are already facing higher than usual caseloads and a second wave of COVID cases. Beyond public health impacts, entire regions and tax bases could be affected by permanent loss of property value, as Natalie mentioned, happened to Paradise, California. An analysis by Redfin in late 2019 found that nearly $2 trillion worth of housing value in California in places like LA, Orange County, Santa Clara County, and San Diego are in wildfire-prone areas at risk to permanently suffer property value reductions from wildfires. And homeowners are obviously not the only ones to suffer loss of value from wildfires. PG&E has been undergoing a highly publicized bankruptcy and was found liable for the 2018 Camp Fire that destroyed Paradise, California. To end its bankruptcy proceedings, it will have to pay $58 billion. Unfortunately, this doesn't spell the end of PG&E's troubles. The utility has also been heavily criticized for planned blackouts during high wildfire potential days, which sometimes affected up to 2 million customers simultaneously in 2019. Next slide, please. Shifting the conversation a bit from impacts from wildfires to the use cases for our data, this slide shows the global exposure of a portfolio of more than 500 real estate sites in our online application. Financial stakeholders, including asset owners and asset managers, can upload their portfolio information directly into our application to understand where they have exposure to wildfire risk in the future. Our clients use this data for a number of reasons, including due diligence and for analyzing hotspots of exposure across portfolios. Our data invites users to investigate high-risk properties further engage with building managers to understand an asset's resilience to wildfires, and research the availability and cost of insurance. They can take the data on highly exposed properties to consider investing in physical changes to the building and land, and determine if the risk-return profile of the asset meets their internal targets. With this data, investors have an opportunity to be ahead of the curve when it comes to understanding and preparing for the impacts of wildfires, and, where relevant, invest and engage in regional and more widespread resilience. Next slide, please. That last point brings me to this final slide on how building resilience to wildfires requires action at many different levels, from the individual building owner up to state and national leaders. Individual building owners and homeowners can take measures like obtain proper insurance or make changes to create a wildfire defensible zone around a building. But the actions of one individual building or homeowner are never enough, because these structures are embedded in wider communities, which must also take measures to build resilience to wildfires. At the community, regional, and state level, there are a number of actions that can help mitigate wildfire risk. These include wildfire hazard mapping, setting and enforcing codes for a fire adaptive building, and building partnerships with local businesses, research institutions, and other community organizations to restore forests to a more resilient state. For instance, the pilot forest resilience bond in Yuba, California has started to take $4 million in bond proceeds to create forest restoration projects like aspen and meadow regeneration, ecosystem protection, and wildfire fuel reduction projects. They have already created 17 new jobs in 2019 and plan to create an additional 79 through the use of bond proceeds for these projects. At the national level, much remains to be done. National agencies like the Forest Service spent $3 billion in 2018 on wildfire suppression alone, leaving less and less funding for other vitally important work like forest restoration. The latest effort to create a national cohesive wildland fire management strategy in the United States has found that what is most needed in tandem are resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, and safe and effective wildfire response. This underscores the important theme that emerged in our research, that there is no silver bullet to build resilience to wildfires, and that preparedness is required across many different levels and many different stakeholders. Members of the financial community have an opportunity to use our wildfire data in a number of ways, including building resilience at the asset level, investing in community and regional resilience efforts, and participating in the global trend towards more private investment to address this growing global threat. And now I'll turn it back to Natalie and we'll take some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Colin. And thank you all who have already submitted your questions. We have several rolling in, which is wonderful. And just a reminder that you are welcome to submit your questions using the Q&A box on your screen. So we have several questions about methodology. So a few of these, one being, are these predictions able to downscale to very specific locations, or rather are they only predicting the country or state level? So Colin, can you answer that for us?
Yes, so the data set that we use is the NASA-NEXT GDDP data set, which is a bias-corrected downscale data set. So that data set comes at a resolution of quarter degree by quarter degree, which is approximately 25 kilometers by 25 kilometers. So that is the resolution that our data is available at.
Thank you. And are KDPI values equally good across the globe, or is it better in certain geographies?
So KBDI was developed in the southeastern United States based on the soil types there. So it is sort of tailored for the southeast United States and doesn't necessarily perform equally as well across the globe. But that being said, KBDI is commonly used as a global wildfire indice, regardless of where it was developed.
Thank you. And then a question about the global climate models and how they represent precipitation distributions for single sites and how sensitive the KDBI values are to precipitation in the climate models.
Yeah, so in general, climate models have difficulty representing precipitation. However, we are using, as I mentioned, the next GDP downscale data set, which is bias corrected. So that does attempt to account for some of the uncertainty in the precipitation model. We are also using an 18 model ensemble. So we are using all the models available through the next GDP data set for the RCP 8.5 scenario. So we are taking steps to address that uncertainties.
Thank you. And then turning it over to Lindsay, a few resilience questions and also questions about our data. One question is, to use our online application, what inputs do the asset owners need, like an address, a geolocation?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The online application, all you need is the address information. If you happen to have latitude, longitude coordinates, it could support that as well. But yeah, all that's needed are just the address information. And then if you have information on the activity type, we take that into account as well when analyzing assets.
Thanks. And then, Lindsay, can you share any examples of fire resilience measures that you see global investors supporting or even just exploring at this point?
Sure. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the Forest Resilience Bond that's in its pilot phase right now in California is open to private investors, obviously, to purchase. And they're doing things like thinning overgrowth and strengthening elements of the watershed. There are other private, public projects as well in places like Oregon. So there's something called the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project, which is a group of public and private stakeholders that do similar sorts of work of thinning trees, controlled burns, to make forests more resilient against wildfires. The European Union as well has initiatives aimed at adaptation measures for wildfires too.
Thank you. And then have you explored any other Mediterranean climates like central Chile and Italy?
Yeah, this is Lindsay again. The model that we use is global, as Colin mentioned, and so we do provide wildfire scores, incorporating information on KBDI and burnable fuel sources across the globe. So we do have scores for those sorts of places. And Italy, of course, in Southern Europe, does have some exposure as well. And I believe that Chile probably would as well. Colin could maybe speak to that more deeply.
Yes, definitely. I think depending on where specifically you are, of course, but I think in general, yeah, our model performs equally well globally and can capture local discrepancies like that.
Thank you. And I will flag too that we did write an analysis covering this methodology and the key takeaways, many of which Lindsay spoke about during the webinar, but we do explore other areas, including other areas in Europe in the paper, which is available on 427mt.com/insights. And a few more questions about the methodology. So questions around if the vegetation model considers deforestation dynamics, and along with that, the wildland-urban interface. Colin, are you able to answer that?
Yeah, so the data set that we use for land cover is the European Space Agency's land cover classification data set. So this is a 300 meter approximately resolution data set and for use for identifying land cover types. And this is a 2015 point in time model. So unfortunately, we're not able to capture deforestation going forward. Rather, we're using the 2015 values and using that to go along with our forward-looking climate projections.
Thank you. And then a question about how the forward-looking data is incorporated into the model and if it's a prediction around magnitude of wildfire and potential impact.
Yeah, so the forward-looking data is derived from the climate models. So these models run out through the end of the century. And we essentially go day by day through time and evaluate KBDI for each given day of the year. The way the KBDI equation works is it uses previous days KBDI values. So we run out KBDI through the end of the century using these climate models and their daily outputs for temperature and precipitation. So that gives us a sense of that 0 to 800 KBDI score. And then we apply 427's methodology to that to arrive at those 0 to 100 scores. So that attempts to put in context what those values of KBDI alongside fuel availability on those dimensions of severity and frequency and raw and differential, what that means on a 0 to 100 scale. So we attempt to kind of quantify the risk through that mechanism.
Thank you. And then a question around how this data could be used at the asset level to inform resilience and investment decisions for forestry and agriculture investments. Lindsay, are you able to speak about that?
Sure. Yeah, the data that we showed during the webinar today is currently available in the online application. So if you have location information, you can immediately get back that 0 to 100 exposure score. For assets that appear with high exposure, be they forestry, agriculture, or individual building locations, the adaptation actions that I described and are described in the paper could be considered. So these are obviously building defensible spaces and working to obtain appropriate insurance, but also engaging in wider regional efforts for resilience because, like I said, any individual action of any individual asset owner has to be considered within the larger community context and what has been done on a wider scale to build resilience to wildfires.
Thank you. I think we will go ahead and wrap up in just a few moments unless there are additional questions. And I just want to reiterate, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Lindsay and Colin, for your insights. And we are definitely sending our best to those enduring the impacts of wildfires and other climate hazards as we speak. And please don't hesitate to reach out with further questions at any time. Thank you.